So today, the third class of managing the small enterprise, as I like to call it, from concept to reality, really we're going to focus a little bit, we'll dive into it and going to help you guys start to figure out how to choose what it is that you should be pursuing if you want to pursue the entrepreneurial path. What's your calling? What's your purpose? I read this tweet yesterday. It said basically, I've seen 70 plus pitch decks in the past few months, and not a single one has been the reason I take a call or decide to invest. While I believe the exercise of putting together a pitch deck is important, send me a thoughtful paragraph instead. And then Ben, who is an investor whose fund I have invested in, he replied, it's never the reason, but it acts as a fantastic signal filtering mechanism. It's like Common App was for college. Flipping decks could quickly help you identify visually and via succinct copy which founders have spent most time thinking about their biz and how to showcase it to others. And then he adds critical skills needed over the company's life cycle. So I saw this, and this was last night. And again, this is a fluid presentation, and I was like, I dumped it. And then I said, hey, let me email Ben and 3-4 other investors that I know and ask them to say, look, I'm giving this class at McGill. It's on entrepreneurship, where I help the students come up with a product and service and take it from concept to reality. Historically, it was all about business plans, so I get that, but naturally, I'm not sure those are most useful or pertinent requirements to secure funding. I saw this tweet and thought of asking you. I'd love to provide a quote from you on what you consider to be the most important when considering making an investment with regards to business plan, executive summary, deck, verbal pitch, and so on. Thanks in advance. Now, again, bear in mind, in this class, you'll be doing a business plan, you'll be learning how to do them. But I just thought we want to be realistic as well. So one person I emailed, John Stokes. John Stokes, a British native who moved to Montreal. I met him about 17 years ago. I talk about the fact that over 100 investors turned me down. And that is true. And John one time was like, stuff it. I offered you an investment, you turned it down. That's your problem. And I was like, you're right, John. So we kind of, even though he's not on my cap table, he's a very smart guy, very instrumental in developing the venture and seed startup stage investing in Montreal. And he replied, the most important thing is that you quickly capture someone's attention using the most appropriate medium available. Capturing attention is like reeling a fish. It starts with an intro paragraph in an email that captures one's attention enough to cause one to open a pitch deck. The pitch deck, especially the first 3 or 4 slides, needs to capture one's attention enough to decide to talk to the founders. So they all matter. They're all steps in reeling the fish. From my perspective, the pitch deck is key. You'll be working on that as well, little parentheses. But the deck needs to be built in a way which makes the reader, 1, care about what you care about, and 2, believe that you can make the thing that the investor now cares about becoming a reality, and 3, understand how them deciding to join the team as an investor will change the trajectory of the venture for the benefit of all involved. P.S. I have never reeled a fish. I add a P.S. I spared you the British accent, which is part of John's charm. David, who is the general partner at Bungalow, which is a fund that I'm a limited partner and investor in, and check them out if you are developing a project and you think Dave is a good investor and his fund is a fit. By all means, I'm happy to make that introduction. He replied, this is a fantastic question, Ash. I'll add some more detail tomorrow. Hasn't sent it in, not a problem. It's early, but I did want to share this. But the single highest leverage action an entrepreneur can do is become a great storyteller. It lowers your cost of capital, meaningful in hiring, attracts the best talent. In financing, it attracts the best terms. In selling, it attracts the best customers, and so on. This is why there's so much investment in the IR function, investor relation function of public companies, but ironically, not in private companies, since it's born out of the founder's DNA. I think it is a skill that can be taught and improved upon. It's why my partner and I are increasingly seeing memos instead of decks or business plans on what the founder story is as one pitching a business. The written word, when done well, really captures the reader's attention, and the reader may be an investor like ourselves, or even a future customer seeing copy on a website. More to break down, but that's the main takeaway as I reflect on thousands of pitches at this point in my career. Nonetheless, last week, one of our teammates asked, basically, when can we start looking at business plans? So I will allude to a few business plans in today's class and link to them. But I decided to move up. Again, this is a roadmap. It's not a blueprint. I kind of read between the lines and said, you know what, let me move up that pillar of finance and accounting in which we look at business plans and decks and executive summaries, so that we could get to it sooner. So in the next class, we'll actually dive into that a bit more. And today I'm going to basically share with you guys also the BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada's template, and you guys could spend your weekends looking at it. And if you have any questions, next class, we're going to basically discuss that. So again, just because I'm focused on a full slideshow screen, if you have any questions, I think optimally just, if you want, speak up or ping Elias. And Elias, my partner in crime, can just jump in when he sees an opportunity. So to switch gears and discuss today's theme, I'm actually going to feature an email from one of our colleagues here, teammates, as I like to call it, the question du jour. Good evening. Me and most of my project teammates are trying to get into medical school. Thus, we are aiming for high grades in all of our courses. Makes sense. We are a bit worried about taking this class since most of us have no business background or no background in business and finance. However, we are still interested in the subject due to a future possibility of owning private clinics, which are businesses. We were wondering how doable it is to end up with an A at the end of the semester. Also, what were the averages in previous years? Kind regards. I hope you don't mind me sharing this because there's nothing really confidential, but it's a question that I think many people have. My answer last night, short and sweet, was, look, success in entrepreneurship is less about business and finance, but mastering your domain of expertise. I would say this class is for someone like you who has expertise in area A and wants to expand into business. I don't think the grading will be hard if you are into the material and immerse yourself into it. So last week at the end during the question session, another teammate basically said, and I went and I had a bit of homework assignment, so here I am returning with the answer. Question, I'm currently working on a startup project. The ideation and market research is already done and the project is in its initial phases of execution. I'm wondering if I could use this project for the class. I already have a business partner not enrolled in the class, so I'm concerned about involving new people, which I'm open to for the class project, but I cannot guarantee that I can continue to involve the members from my group if they want to after the course is over. My initial reply, which we discussed in the Q&A last class was, look, I understand that there's a risk of bringing classmates on if they get committed, attached, and mainly have expectations. I will ask a lawyer if having them sign an agreement whereby they release any claims would be sufficient to protect you. And ideally, if they contribute, and that's supposed to be they, if the person contributes in a constructive manner, is complimentary to you, and you offer them something at your discretion to stay involved, if they add value, but again, at your discretion. But this way, you avoid headaches down the road. A lawyer who's very well regarded, very well respected, very much experienced in this world said, quote, that would work, but a bit intense for students. The student should tell the classmate that this is a live project that they are working on and that they are happy for them to use it for the school project, but that the new teammate's contribution will be owned by the company, and that the classmate, the new participant, will have no right going forward in writing, end quote. I agree it's a bit intense, but again, this class has to be realistic because entrepreneurship, the stakes are high. Now, of course, this is relevant and this is key, right? Like this is probably, everybody has to not be distracted and listen to what I'm about to say. This is relevant, this advice, to the classmate in the team who one would assume would get more insights into the project. There's nothing in theory precluding a fellow classmate outside of the team to find inspiration in that idea, or in a classroom is a public forum, in my humble opinion. And in that sense, it's a bit akin to presenting a project at a conference and people in attendance hearing and running with parts or the whole project. So there you have it. This is basically a paramount risk of entrepreneurship. It's a paradox. You have to open up to others to build a team, to receive financing. And sometimes the investor has an investment or is about to make an investment in your competitors. And I've lived that many, many, many times. But in doing so, you risk having your baby snatched away from you. There's an African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Now, this is a huge consideration for you to make, but you have to be reasonable. I'm going to read a statement because I want to stay on script. You'll understand why. You need to understand the law once you venture into entrepreneurship. It's the same way that you have to understand accounting. You have to understand debt. You have to understand credit. You have to understand the terms and conditions. It's less about, like I said, business, finance. It's really, really, really about a confluence of factors. In Quebec, we have the civil code. There's an expectation that parties act in good faith, yes, but at the merit stage, the courts will ask, was there a crime committed? Did someone break the law? I work in media and entertainment, so in addition to Quebec law, California case law and precedents are pertinent, especially if companies are domiciled there. There have been cases regarding implied contract, for example, where a producer has an implied contract, an implied responsibility with a writer when taking a meeting to not circumvent that writer if they choose to pursue it. Indeed, and I allude to this only when it makes sense and only when it's I find helpful to you. When I found out that my favorite movie producer had decided to develop a TV show based on my book, Alexander the Great, which after I met her, I shared our slate, and she decided to pursue it without me, naturally, I was disappointed, and I shared with her my point of view. She's a very accomplished producer, and she's a lawyer. She didn't reply to me at first, and this is where you guys have to start to decide how you manage risk. And after a month, her lawyers got back to me, and they disagreed. Her point of view was different than my point of view. It was not about emotions, it was not about feelings, but it was about facts and the law. Now, I didn't let it, partly because I wanted, at the time, to play a constructive commercial and creative role. Eventually, I won't lie, she got fed up, and her lawyers threatened me. And basically, they said, if you discuss the matter, just conduct yourself accordingly. But I said, with what? What are they threatening me? Is it defamation? Is it blackmail? Is it extortion? Spell it out. Is it being crazy? Now, I didn't know, but I had to make sure that I knew and I respected the law, which I always do. Now, at WatchMojo, I've had to study libel, defamation, slander, so I knew that I wasn't defaming her. And then I said, oh, you just don't want me to talk about this, so let me build a whole class around it. I'm kidding. So when a classmate asks this question, and I spoke to a lawyer, I think the key here, and the key that you're going to need with employees and with partners, is called the meeting of the minds. And in this case, you want to have that in writing. Throughout my career, I've learned many lessons, and later on, when we discuss legal, non-disclosure agreements, non-circumvention agreements, jurisdiction, implied contracts, discovery, depositions, and so on, you can learn from my experiences. So ultimately, without dwelling on it, you have to find that middle ground. I don't want students coming back to me to complain. I don't want there to be fighting about this stuff. This is why you want to have this in a classroom before you get out there in the real world. So again, if you want to go far, you go together. If you want to go fast, go alone. That is an African proverb. Now, mind you, I don't know how Africa has fared throughout history by buying into that. But again, I'll leave that for others to discuss. Anyway, let's get to the class, today's class, which is basically, I want to make this class practical and fruitful. That is my number one objective, right? So the class title is From Concept to Reality. It is not From Concept to Coma. In that vein, as I was speaking to my network, I also want to put this extra resource on your radar. I was speaking to Pelra. Pelra is Director of Corporate Venture Capital at Québecor. So she and I are fellow investors in a VR esports gaming company called Arcadia, and we were catching up. And when I told her I was teaching, when I told her about different stuff I'm doing, if you are interested in applying for this Québecor bursary through their Asterix fund, this is a link. Again, when I share, don't go hitting up Pelra out of the blue. Just I would suggest you follow them on social media. And when I share the class notes, you click on this and you apply. There's 5 bursaries that you can win between 15,000 and 75,000, which is really, really cool. This first pillar, I call it the conditions for entrepreneurial success, right? And there's a number of things that I alluded to. It's like, are you an entrepreneur? Are you an entrepreneur? Should you follow your passion? We'll discuss the concept of comparative advantage, one of the linchpins of all of economic theory. Speaking of economic theory, demand and supply, how to choose your co-founders, the role your spouse will play, regardless of whether, like in my case, where I was lucky, my spouse was one of the co-founders. 16 years later, still, I think, likes me, loves me, doesn't want to kill me most of the time. How do I pull that off? And then really just the socioeconomic reality that will explain whether or not you'll have success as an entrepreneur. So Scott Galloway, you should follow him. He's a teacher at NYU, former entrepreneur, kind of crazy, but like good crazy. And he always says this, he goes, people that tell you to follow your passion are already rich. And he's kind of right. Like somebody will make money in copper melting, something not exactly very sexy, become a billionaire. And then they're like, I'm a painter who recreates old stamps. That's my passion. And you're like, hey, how do they live on a yacht? Well, it's not the stamps, it's the copper. So he adds, quote, your job as a young person is not to find your passion. Don't believe that bullshit. If someone's telling you to follow your passion, that means they're already rich. Your job is to find something you are really good at and then become great at it, end quote. In today's reality, when everybody has a microphone, I think there's a lot of people that say a lot of outlandish things. I think Scott has said a lot of things that were right, but as they say, and I say this about myself, even a broken clock is right twice a day. I agree with you that everything you read online and everything you hear from me, take with a grain of salt and in fact, apply it to your own reality, right? So I think it's more about, hey, this is a resource. This is a resource that you might go see an investor and an investor might reference. You don't want to be unaware of them. So I think that was the context, but that's a great point, and I'm glad you said it and not me. So moving along, I think instead of should you follow your passion, there's a few questions you should ask yourself. One is, what are the demand and supply dynamics, right? Everybody wants to be like a writer covering their favorite sports team, if you think about it. A lot of people want to be musicians. American Idol rolls into town. There's a line across, the biggest mall in the city with people that have this dream. So the fundamental variable that determines your earning power, where you could put food on table, provide shelter to your family, is going to be demand and supply. So before any career path or any entrepreneurial opportunity, you need to make that assessment. Secondly, you should not work for free. That is not at all what I'm saying. But ask yourself, would you do this for free? Because you have to commit yourself at least 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I don't lose sight of my privilege. I didn't have a rich uncle, but because of the early decisions I made in my career and the early sacrifices I made, I put myself in a position to succeed. I made a little bit of money, and that little bit of money was enough to carry me for 5 years to fund the company, and I didn't take a salary. 5 years. In fact, I even mortgaged my condo to stay afloat. I loved it. I was willing to do it, not so much because I was passionate about, at the time, video or top 10 lists or pop culture, but I was really, really passionate and excited about being an entrepreneur, being the person in the arena who could have impact, who could make change, who could make decisions, etc. So as you start to ask yourself, should I do A or B? It's really not about just passion. It's about these dynamics. Do you have a comparative advantage? We'll explain in a few slides what that means. And then yes, after you've asked yourself those more rational questions, ask yourself the more emotional question, am I passionate about this? Now, timing matters. The name of the game, every entrepreneur I speak to, we share this reality. You've got to stay in the game, which basically means you got to not run out of money. Before you thrive, you have to put yourself in a position to thrive, which means you just have to survive. But even before that, you have to just get in the game. You can't talk about becoming an entrepreneur for a decade. Now, your personal situation is paramount, right? Ageism is a thing. I don't think you have to be young to be successful as an entrepreneur. Au contraire, I think some of the experiences you learn are going to be instrumental. But if you have a spouse who is not supportive, that's going to be a problem before you realize it's a problem. If you have kids, well, it's good because it forces you to value your time. But I assure you, I'm so grateful for my 2 daughters, but there's no way I would have had the same trajectory and success if I would have had kids when I started, because I used to work 80, 90, 100-hour work weeks by willingness, by desire. Now, your opportunity cost and your life stage are key considerations. If you're making $400,000 a year as a top shop lawyer and you have a very expensive house with a mortgage, a cottage upstate, and you want to travel 3 times to the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and climb, Mount Everest every year, that's not really going to be possible when you take the dive. And a lot of people don't realize that. And it's fine. It's perfectly okay to say, yeah, I like my lifestyle as it is. You got to manage your burn rate. You got to maintain your runway. And you got to know, again, like I said, how debt works, how taxes work, right? That will all save you. But assuming after all this, you still want to proceed, then you got to ask yourself, what is your comparative advantage? I love history. I love ancient history and 20th century history. And if you think of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, Plato, one of the most influential thinkers of the time, he was the founder of the Academy in Athens. And he basically, in his epic book, The Republic, he looked at this concept of the principle of specialization, which is a backbone of economic theory. He basically divided society into 3 classes: the class of producers, farmers, craftsmen, doctors, the class of warriors, and the class of rulers. Now, it's kind of funny because you should take everything with a grain of salt. Naturally, he kind of put philosophers at the top of the pyramid, so to speak, because, oh, wait, he was one. He was a philosopher. But the point was, specialization ensured that the classes remained in fixed relations of power and influence, but ultimately that as a society, the sum of the parts yielded the most. And what I love about Plato is there was a parallel between the 3 parts of the soul and the 3 parts of Plato's ideal society: the guardian, the auxiliaries, and the craftsman. So in business, I would just simplify it to say you have to focus on something, but once you know what to focus on, right? Early on, if you focus on something, you might be missing out on the bigger opportunity. Now, why is focus important? Because it's true, whether you like Kevin O'Leary or you dislike Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank, whatever you pay attention to grows. That is true. When I read his book, when I read his book, because I was interviewing him like a decade ago, and there were some very, very interesting lines which he learned as an entrepreneur. And the first one was, whatever you devote your time, your energy, your attention to will grow. And that's why it's very, very important to be positive, because what you pay attention to grows. If your attention is attracted to negative situations and emotions, then they will grow in your awareness. And God forbid, internally. That's a quote from Deepak Chopra. So I quote Steve Jobs. This specific quote about the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, and the troublemakers, I read it in the previous class, so I'm not going to bore you again. But the point is, with the rise of entrepreneurship as an accepted mainstream career path to success, you are seeing more and more people pursue entrepreneurship instead of so-called traditional careers. Entrepreneurship is a lifestyle. It's a mindset. When Richard Branson came on the scene 30, 40, 50 years ago, it was like, he was a rebel. Mark Cuban further popularized that. Our parents' generation inspired us to become doctors and lawyers, and then we wanted to be venture capitalists, private equity bankers. Today, it's more about becoming an entrepreneur because of the lifestyle, because of the so-called freedom, which is really a paradox. Again, entrepreneurship is living a few years like no one wants to be able to live the rest of your life like no one can. There's very few people that would have lived those 5-6 years when I started Watch Mojo, because it was an insane amount of mental, physical, and emotional pain. And I loved it because entrepreneurs are masochists, and we'll talk about that later. 20, 30 years ago, Watch Mojo is a pop culture phenomenon. We're going to start talking a little bit about how I looked at it, at the opportunity, and I'm using my experience for you guys to apply to yourself and look at the opportunities today. But 30, 40 years ago in the 80s and 90s, if you looked at business and entrepreneurship in pop culture, it was the exception to the rule. Sure, you had a movie like Wall Street, a movie like Glenn Ross, but it wasn't as prevalent as in the 2000s and 2010s. You had The Wolf of Wall Street, The Big Short, The Social Network. Even in scripted television and on streaming platforms, Billions, Silicon Valley, Mad Men, Succession on now. So yes, there's a lot of capital out there, but there's a ton more entrepreneurs chasing capital. So just because you think you could go out there and raise the kind of money and do any project that you want, investors are actually more discerning than that. And in fact, a little parentheses, I've made a lot of investments at I have a lot of investments in publicly traded companies, and I have a lot of investments in very, very seed, early, stage investments. Very early, it's very easy to find capital between friends, families, one network. But then once you actually have to show that you have some traction and go raise a proper Series A round, that's where a lot of entrepreneurs are waking up and looking at the tab and going, oh, I don't quite know what I got myself into. And we're going to discuss all that. So what is this? Most of you probably don't know. It's a fax machine. I'm kidding. I'm assuming you know what this is. The point I'm making is none of you have really gone through a real cycle. Sequoia, Google's investor, one of the best investment firms out there, they published this in 2008 called Rest in Peace, the Good Times. This is ancient history to you. I might as well be talking Plato. Now, there was a popular slide there that says when, excuse the language, when the shit hits the fan, you're better off making deep cuts right away to survive. If you try to kind of hold it out and make a little bit of cut here to these costs, a little bit of cut to that cost, you end up finding yourself in a debt spiral and you are no longer a going concern. You guys have never gone through this. Most entrepreneurs I talk to have never gone through this. They'll email me out of the blue saying, hey, we're raising a round. I love your stuff. Here's our wire instructions and our SAFE, our simple agreement for future equity investment. And I'm like, oh, so Cam, what are you talking about? What are you doing? Explain yourself. What is your business? So I think right now we are obviously in a bit of a frothy period, and there's going to be a correction at some point. There's always cycles, but you guys have to decide not so much about what you want to do in 2022, but where do you think you'll have the most shot of success in 2025? If I dare say 2032. And that's the reality. So when it comes to choosing your path, yeah, to quote Warren Buffett, you shouldn't have a herd mentality. Don't follow the institutional imperative. Just because every other headline is NFT doesn't mean you should be pursuing NFT, right? And he calls that the institutional imperative. I say basically just don't be a sheep. Now, don't fight yesterday's wars. We're Canadian. We have to reference Wayne Gretzky, otherwise we lose our passports. Every VC I met for from 2005 to 2015 had this, Fred Wilson, one of the greatest investors. I met him when he was in New York. On his business card, there's this line. I was like, dude, come on. But it's true. Quote, I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been, end quote. It's true. It's a cliche, but don't go chasing yesterday's battle. When people come to me and say, I'm launching a YouTube channel, I'm like, great, what's your TikTok strategy, right? So fish where the fish are. And basically, if you're a farmer, it's great. You have great watermelons. Who's going to come on your farm? You got to go to the marketplace. Now, before I dive into the Watch Mojo case study, this is really where I'm opening up a bit more about what I saw, how I pivoted. And this is less about like making it autobiographical. It's more about you guys. Almost every time I tell you why I zigged and I zagged, I want you guys to internalize this vis-a-vis the opportunity you are exploring to help you save a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of energy. Any questions before proceeding? All right, so I had alluded previously, success is about ambition, vision, execution, persistence, luck, timing, focus, resiliency, and a few other things. Luck and timing matter. I'm sorry, luck and timing matter quite a bit. So, as you know, started my career in search, then I moved to online publishing. And the reality was when I left AskMen after IGN bought AskMen and News Corp Fox bought IGN, I had a non-competition agreement that said, don't do an online men's magazine, which is, parentheses, ironic because I ended up getting sued frivolously, meritless, accused of violating my non-competition agreement, which I wasn't. I went to court, I destroyed them. Luck, timing, it wasn't that I was this great lawyer, it was that they didn't have a strong case, but it was scary. In any case, ironically, because I could not be in the text content business, I set my sights on video. So yes, you could say it was vision, and I knew that was the future, but it was also because I could not do text content. At the end of the day, I'm more writer than video maker, so to speak. But I could see this was the future, so I needed to be aware of the bigger opportunity. If I would have wanted to prove something to the world and go build a better version of AskMen, that would have been a loser's proposition. I had to let that go and set my sights on the future. So there's a reality, this right now again, ding, 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 focus on this. This is going to be such a big determinant of your success, which is the labor reality. I was sitting at TechCrunch. This is Roloff Botha. He's a partner at Sequoia. And he basically was sitting there. If we were in a classroom as close as the student in the first row, and he said, you got to be in Silicon Valley because this is where all the engineers are. And, if you're not close to where your talent is, you're doomed. I said, good. At the time, this was like 2007 or so, I was running an incubator and WatchMojo was one of many projects, and there was some tech products there. And I said, you know what? In Montreal, I see what's going to happen. I alluded to John Stokes. I said there's going to be more venture capital activity. And because of the tax credits that the government generously offers, there's going to be a lot more big technology companies like Microsoft, Google, Facebook eventually, Apple, who are going to come here and set up shop. And it's going to be really, really hard for me to compete with that, right? So that in the back of your mind has to be a key consideration. Do you think that you could hire the kinds of people and profiles that you're going to need to succeed? If you don't think you can hire those people, already put that piece of paper aside, see if there's another opportunity where their labor reality is more in your favor. Conversely, less so now, especially with this work from home reality, ask yourself, would you pack up your bags and relocate to San Fran, LA, New York, Miami, Wichita, Kansas, or Moldova? Nothing against Wichita or Moldova, but the point is, even with this work from home reality, I'm not sure if you will be able to maximize your business out of Montreal. Montreal is a great place to live. It's a great place to start a business, but you're going to hit a wall. So you have to ask yourself, are you willing to relocate? Creativity is in Montreal's DNA. And yes, you do not need to limit yourself to Montreal. But nonetheless, I'm telling you a story of WatchMojo. And WatchMojo for the last Montreal for the last 20, 30 years had emerged as a video game hub. It started to become an artificial intelligence hub as well. And if you think of Montreal's exports, Cirque du Soleil, Just for Laughs, Vice, and WatchMojo, that's what I tell people. To Americans, I go, hey, the same way that MTV and ESPN were early on cable, WatchMojo was early on YouTube. Now we had to diversify and expand. But when I talk to Canadians, or when I talk to people they ask, well, what was the role of Montreal? I'm very proud to say that, look, we are the latest great export out of the city after these brands. Now, an alternative take regarding competition is I didn't want to compete with Microsoft, Google, and Facebook because they could throw money. And before COVID, especially, employees had less options. And well, pound for pound, I did not want to be in the technology rat race because I knew that we could not compete with Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, and so on. So to understand WatchMojo, you really need to understand web video and YouTube. I alluded to this earlier, content is king basically means that as distribution evolves and new distribution emerges, you could take your content and put it on these new shelves and generate incremental revenue. But without distribution, content doesn't have that much value, right? So I call content be king, distribution is king, and I say context, a given content in a given distribution as the prince, meaning the future. That's how you should look at it. Historically, consumers watched videos through different interfaces, different technology. You had Real Player way back. Then you had the portals in the early 2000s. And I started WatchMojo around the time that you had companies like YouTube, Rever, Gruba, Dailymotion, and MetaCafe compete. Now, over time, YouTube won AVOD, advertising video on demand, and Netflix bought SVOD, subscription video on demand. Today, we're in a very exciting and scary time when, in theory, I could wake up, look at my phone, as I walk down to my kitchen, technically my wall could be a screen, my fridge could be a screen, I get in my self-driving car, which I don't have now, but you get where we're going, and I'm continuing to consume content, and then AirPods or the chip in my brain. So we're moving towards this 24/7 connectivity, which basically just creates more opportunities. Now, in terms of content producers, WatchMojo is a pioneer for sure, but we all stand on others' shoulder. In the late 90s, Steven Spielberg launched pop.com, didn't go anywhere, didn't even start. In New York, you had Pseudo, but there was no broadband. Consumers were not watching videos, so that went nowhere. And then after the dot-com crash, you had the mania TVs and the heavy TVs who all wanted to be like MTV. But they were building everything at once: content, distribution, sales, and the infrastructure, which was fighting too many fronts at once. I always reference Hitler in World War II, who was basically pushing out on the, like going to the Atlantic, doing pretty well. And then once he started to basically take on Russia on the other side, then he caved in. So you can't fight too many battles at the same time. When I joined, when I started Watch Mojo in the mid-2000s, we were all naive. Next New Networks, Revision 3, the company behind Big Nation, for the OGs who were watching videos back then, and Watch Mojo, we wanted to build our own websites, our owned and operated websites. But eventually we pivoted to these distribution platforms like YouTube, because that's where the audience was. And then over time, slowly but surely, you had traditional media who was reluctant, and they embraced video online in one way or another. And ultimately, you've seen now the empire strikes back, where traditional media like Marvel, Disney, Comcast, Peacock, Paramount, and many others have just said, look, this is the future, and times have changed. And partly times have changed because the people who are making these decisions have changed. If somebody is 35 now, and basically, you know, in a management role at Viacom, well, they're not the same philosophy of the people who sued YouTube. That 35-year-old was 18 when YouTube started. So they grew up in college with YouTube. They're like, we have to be on YouTube, right? So again, socioeconomic conditions matter. This is literally a slide from one of my early decks. So we had no funding. I put $1 million to be generous. It really was $250,000 of my investments in cash and savings and whichever organs I could kind of sell off in the back alley somewhere. I'm kidding about that last one. And then I had to go use another 500,000 in debt. So again, false modesty aside, if you mortgage your place and you avoid layoffs, yeah, your team is going to be kind of loyal to you. The early team, the new people, don't know about that and don't care, and they shouldn't care. But so forget being morally bankrupt, how you treat people will matter. It will pay dividends far more than anything else. So I basically built all of Watch Mojo with about 750, and at our peak, or at our nadir, I was $900,000 in the hole. I didn't have $900,000 when we started, right? So the point is, we didn't spend heavily on overhead. We didn't get premature. And frankly, too much money, more problems. You throw money at problems thinking they are solutions, they are not. So we played the long game. We had to build a catalog. We had to build sustainable distribution. We stayed nimble, agile, flexible, and we adapted. And that's a lot of our success. So you've seen this pyramid in many, many ways. I showed you the first iteration of that in that TechCrunch article. Eventually, we had a graphics person who could make it prettier. So the only thing here I'm going to make, and again, you're going to be asked to do a visual graphic like this because it's important in terms of storytelling. Don't take it from me, take it from all these other investors, take it from some of our classmates who have alluded to this. So this is the way I looked at the market. You had a very finite amount of super premium content from the ABCs, NBCs, Foxes, CBSs of the world that was not embracing the web. So it was sitting either in pirated offline environments or just not available. And then let's skip the middle. All the way at the bottom, you had user-generated content, which Time Magazine picked you, Y-O-U, as the person of the year that was basically disrupting media. You know, if there was some crazy revolution going on in Egypt and people were out in the streets recording it, that was very different than back in the day when you basically had stuff happening and journalists kind of writing about it. Maybe some video about it, or maybe an image. Think China, the gentleman standing in front of the tank, like very powerful, but that's all you have. You could read about what happened, but very different than what actually happened, which is very different when everybody has one of these, right? But what I realized was I said, look, I had a lot of competitors that were trying to kill Hollywood. And I'm like, you're an idiot. You're not going to be able to produce better content than Hollywood. But I also was like, the company that is going all in on UGC and thinking that Coca-Cola will want their great brand next to crap, which is what the critics called UGC. Yeah, I don't think that's going to work either. So we recognized that the opportunity was in the middle, and we focused and we fine-tuned. Now, over time, this rise of the prosumer, which is basically PewDiePie, Mr. Beast, these guys are now empires. Michelle Phan, these gals, they built these huge enterprises that started off as talent-driven, but they were smart to diversify. So you have to start to see what the opportunity is, and then nip away until you get to success. So remember, this is earlier on, the grade composition. So one of the details of your grade will be that 1.4 in the course outline. Create a visual, like my pyramid, to position your product, service, or opportunity. Why? Because your fundraising audience, your investors, won't read what you send them. I assure you they're not going to read the business plan you're going to write in this class, but we're going to do it to appease the McGill gods. But an image is worth 1,000 words. You will need to stand out, cut through the clutter, and convey your vision, and the market opportunity. So again, each student has to create a visual. It can be part of the business plan you're building. So one of you could do something on the market, one of you could do something on the product, one of you could do something on the competition, and they all go into it. Or if one of you goes, look, guys, I'm a team member, I'm a team player, but I really want to do this visual about something else. Okay, you could do something about something else. But every project, every submission, business plan will have to have at least one. And Elias and I can expand and discuss that a bit more. Okay, is there a question or is that from before? No. And then I want you guys to create a video. Now, a video could be literally what we're doing here in Zoom. You know, it's just that storytelling is all about video, and YouTube is the world's #2 search engine. If you don't have a presence on YouTube or through video, one, you are letting others tell your story at best, or worse, you're creating a vacuum for competitors. So could be anything. Could be a snazzy video that you would win an Oscar for, or it could be something pretty rudimentary that you could effectively put on YouTube. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people come to me and they're like, we don't have any video assets. We've never done video. I'm like, you have to start. You know, if I showed you the first videos in 2006, I'd be read in shame. They don't look that good compared to what we do now, but you have to start somewhere. So this is basically the breakdown. Elias and I will get more specific on the participation, but again, my goal is not, I'm not some kind of frustrated person who's going to come out here and try to screw you guys out of points. You know, we want you guys to succeed, but we built, I think, something that has a group component, because success in entrepreneurship is a group project, but we also want to be fair where you're somewhat in control of your destiny. So there's a lot of individual things. And we even break down where you could kind of rack up and points and put points on the board through the visual and the video production, and eventually a press release, and et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to continue, but we'll get more specific on this. So if you remember, I said, don't take it from me. The business plan is not that important. It's all about the pitch deck, but this being a class that is anchored around a business plan, we will work on that. And so you could click on this and download and read the business plan template from the BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada, which is a fine template. They're all fundamentally the same. You could also download Guy Kawasaki, the Garage VC, his pitch deck template, and start to familiarize yourself with these. You should do so. And then in the next class, when we look at finance, accounting, and business planning, there's going to be a lot more that we're going to, discuss about how to do an effective business plan and a deck. And so you should spend some time this weekend on that, and we will make these available as well. But you can also, if you want, spend some time going down memory lane. This is I don't know what I was thinking with the fonts. Maybe I was feeling somewhat creative, but this is an actual business plan from the Mojo Supreme incubator that was all about digital media services and technology. You want a good example in lack of focus? At the time, we had MetaMojo, a vertical search. We had Watch Mojo, which became what it is today. We had Street Mojo, which was a really cool project, but it's kind of like Groupon, Twitter, really a good idea, but just I wasn't going to be able to focus on that. Blogger Mojo, which was a network of blogs. 10 Mojo, which was a kind of aggregation of top 10 lists, which eventually you could imagine more with Watch Mojo. So when I share this deck with you, you can literally click on it and access it and read on it. Again, I'm not saying it's what you should follow. I also decided to share some quasi-executive summaries or pitches. This is a pitch I made to CNET. No, sorry. This is an executive summary that I couldn't figure out whom I sent to, which in the end also had kind of out of nowhere, well, here's an offer. You can invest $2.5 million at a 10 pre-money. The narrator adds they did not go for it. Or option 2, you could do a smaller round. Anyway, so it's interesting if you are interested in this to see how a crazy madman today was thinking back then. Here I was feeling very artsy. This was a deck. Again, this is a 2007 deck. I will spare you some pain by not going through it now, but I do, if you are interested, go through it. And if you want to discuss anything on the next class, by all means, you are a bigger masochist than even I am. But I mean, it is interesting when you go through what I was envisioning then and what happened. This beauty, this shit of, I'm surprised on the right, nobody was enthralled to just write me a blank check. This is the Mojo Supreme Media Kit. And you know, video online was so nascent then that I had to actually show a TV for people to understand what the hell we were trying to build, which was a producer, publisher, and syndicator of original video, yada, yada, yada. And you see all the different videos that we had. When I tell you we were not that focused, we were producing videos on auto, business, technology, comedy, education, fashion, film, health, fitness. You get the idea. Not very focused, throwing a lot at the wall, which is fine. It got us to where we are now. Some industry presentations. This I was presenting at the John Wilson School of Business down the street at Concordia, my alma mater. And this was March 2012. So this was when we were on the precipice of success, not quite yet. I was, you know, bloody, wounded, battle scarred, but starting to get out of the trenches and seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, which was not yet another oncoming train. If you want to click on it, you could. You guys are suffering enough with this presentation. Again, this is interesting. I thought I would share because these are two intercompany decks that I created way early. CNET, which my lordy, CNET was acquired by CBS and now it's part of Red Ventures. But CNET is a very popular reference and source on all things tech. They were interested in us because they were a text-heavy website. CNET owned GameSpot, one of those, not the store. They owned a website that competed with IGN, and IGN had bought AskMen, so they're like, hey, who's this crazy guy? Let's see if we want to invest or buy it. We kind of discussed very briefly an acquisition that went nowhere. I went to see them in San Fran. I always used to go to meetings, get on the plane, full of dreams, full of hope. I would come back, you know, somewhat despaired and down, but would find a way to kind of pick up my spirits and persevere for the next time somebody would reject me, which is all good. And then this is a deck that I created for, at the time, the parent of the Montreal Gazette, CanWest, today called Post Media. And basically they had all these websites and all these different assets. And the idea was that like we could create videos. So if you're reading an article on the Montreal Gazette about, hey, travel getaway to Miami, we could complement that with a video. So again, I made those available. Memo, you're going to need a thick skin. So this is Sean Colo. Sean Colo was a really sharp, is a very sharp finance guy. He's a private equity guy, and he combined his skill set with Richard Rosenblatt, who ultimately was the executive at Intermix who bought MySpace. MySpace was founded by a couple of guys, but so Richard Rosenblatt at the time had a lot of like street cred for basically identifying MySpace when MySpace was like Facebook. And so they launched Demand Media, and Demand Media was a content farm. It was basically like, we're going to outsmart Google, and they bragged about that. And then Google obviously didn't like that. But so I remember like we were discussing a partnership, and he kind of asked me what we were looking for. And I kind of said, look, I'm trying to raise money at a 10 million valuation. I'm not sure $1 million, which I understood to be what he was kind of hinting at an offer and valuation. I said $1 million is, I didn't say offensive, nothing offends me. And otherwise I'd be the most offended person in the history of life. But I was just like, yeah, I'm not sure $1 million would cut it. So instead of him just leaving it at that, you're down, let me kick you a bit more. To be clear, I did not offer $1 million. I indicated a value in the range of a few $100,000 to as much as $1 million based on more video reviews. Like now that I've taken a look at you, I think the value would be at or below the low range of the range. Basically, okay. So this is what you have to put up with. Now, demand went into the toilet just because, and I'm not, you know, it's just the reality was, to me, it didn't make sense that content, it wasn't about producing the maximum amount of content at the lowest price. Content was about balance. You didn't need to be the Wall Street freaking Journal, but you also couldn't have automated robotic content that any person with a 2-digit IQ would be like, this is quite coherent blabber. But it goes to show at the time, Sean Colo and Sean Colo's a great guy. He's like, he eats glass and the glass ends up bleeding to death, right? He's a very tough executive, and you deal with these guys who are like sitting on their throne and just, get, as I've said, entrepreneurs are masochists and executives are sadists. A lot of the people you're going to go out there are sadistic, and they are going to get a kick and a high out of kicking you. And it's really, really, this is why you don't just need perseverance, you need resistance, you need resilience, right? So, and frankly, a lot of investors will admit this, a lot of investors are failed entrepreneurs. They will admit it. They're like, hey, I tried something. The ones who are, somewhat humble and sane will say, look, I started this. I'm really happy that I got a kick at entrepreneurship. Timing matters. Stars didn't align. It's all good. Live and learn. Others fail at an entrepreneur, fail out of companies, but they become an investor. And then they got all this money because there's a lot of capital out there. And they almost think that like they made that money. And you go in there, and the number of investors that I've met who I'm like, man, this person has not done anything, but they are sitting on a pile of cash. So, how much do I want to swallow my pride and kind of just sit here and pretend, this game of charades makes any sense? And this is the racket you're in. And it really feels good not to really have to ever do that. And why I like to be polite and respectful when entrepreneurs come. Sometimes I'm too much, because then I'm like, this entrepreneur has not really done anything yet. I want to help them, but why am I treating them like they're Mark Zuckerberg? So for me, a turning point was actually when YouTube ignored us and totally launched. Recently in 2021, YouTube announced a $100 million package for creators to compete with TikTok. So this is out there, it's in the press. What's funny is back in 2011, so history repeats itself, or at least it rhymes, YouTube paid $100 million to, many people, including Vice. They ignored us, they snubbed us. It's fine. The reality was we did not deserve to be considered. In 2011, we were not really focused on YouTube. YouTube was one of many distribution platforms. That night, Sunday night, after a weekend where I was sulking and really upset that we were not even considered, like we were not even told of the program, I swallowed my pride and I sent them a very respectful and polite email. And I said, hey, I read about this. Could we be included and participate? And they said, well, we've already done it. We don't even know kind of who you are, even though we were outside of YouTube, a well-regarded web video startup, but we had never paid attention to YouTube. As a user, I was on YouTube quite a bit, like watching videos and stuff, but it wasn't really a key distribution partner. And so YouTube won video. We alluded to why Google won search last week. I won't take you through all the steps, and you could click through that link on YouTube and watch the video. Today, I'm just going to go through that same carousel, and you could watch the video on your own time if you're not, if you haven't suffered enough. But so why YouTube won, I think, is again 12 steps. One was it was started by 3 members of the so-called PayPal mafia, not a literal mafia, just PayPal veterans who left. So they had a little bit of experience and they had seen a little bit about what worked. Sequoia's brass balls. I'm sorry if that's crude. That's how I referred to it the first time. But Sequoia was super risk taker, and they were fine with fair use risk. It's not fair use, with DMCA risk, which was basically let people upload what they want and deal with it later. YouTube was the first thing to go viral in video because you could embed Flash Video, which was Adobe's technology. You could take a video and just embed a line of code on any website, including MySpace. So we talked about how Google won because Yahoo, the portal, put Google on its website. Well, I got news for you. YouTube partly won because MySpace opened up the gates and let YouTube in, and Rupert Murdoch, after he bought MySpace, hated that and he wanted to kill YouTube, which didn't happen. The reality is YouTube's roots are in pirated content. I don't think I'm saying anything shocking, and they mastered the DMCA. And later on, when I talk about mental well-being and I talked about legal, I'm going to tell you why it was really frustrating that YouTube kept at the time throwing me under the train or WatchMojo under the bus, because they didn't love that we relied on fair use, even though, look in the mirror, you built a business around the DMCA. The Google acquisition was a game changer. It was the right partner. It gave them legal, technology, sales, a lot of time and patience to let the product emerge into what it was. And frankly, Google Video wasn't successful, so Google left YouTube alone. The YouTube, if Google Video had not existed, I think Google would have said, we are the masters of the internet, let us take over. But because Google's own product sucked, and didn't go anywhere, then YouTube was left alone. And so the Google technology stack was key in being able to host all that. And then they integrated things really, really well. I don't want to use the M word, monopoly, but one of the reasons why back in the day, Standard Oil and AT&T and Microsoft were attacked was because of the concept of vertical and horizontal integration, which again, YouTube is not a monopoly. It's not what I'm getting at. But the way Google was able to take AdWords and was able to take DoubleClick and inject it in YouTube stack basically helped YouTube become the juggernaut that it is today. And then the legal resources. Viacom sued YouTube claiming damages in $1 billion range. And ultimately, it's because YouTube was owned by Google that was richer than God that they could defend it and outlast it. And in the end, it was a stalemate, which means basically YouTube won. And like Google early on in search, YouTube was fine to punt early on monetization, whereas everybody else was aggressively monetizing it, right? So there's a few other things that get a bit more nitty gritty, but the point is, ultimately, I believed in YouTube from the get-go. You should be looking, if you have a product or service, you should be thinking of distribution. Is your distribution online? Is it Walmart? Even if you're a digital retailer, well, where do you go get your distribution, meaning where do you get your clients? Always believed in YouTube, was calling it the greatest M&A deal as early as 2011. But the problem was, oh, I did not mean to click on this, but there's proof that if you click on this, you will land to somewhere. And so there was a lot of popular formats and we were doing a bit of everything. And eventually I would look at the different genres throughout the years, and it started off with pirated content and UGC, do it yourself, music. And when we really kind of went all in, I loved lists, but I realized like, hey, attentions are short span now and people are really cluttered. And I got to find the formula that makes sense amongst category, style, format. And again, if you have a product that's like shampoo for dogs, it's the color, it's the size, it's the price. These are all levers that you have to play with like a mad scientist in your lab to nail that right product. And a lot of what is old is new, right? America's Funniest Home Videos were reinvented as juke and media. Letterman, Wayne's World, and Moses, the 10 Commandments came back as Watch Mojo. Candid Camera and JFL's Gags, that was prank channels. Matt TV and SNL, you had Smosh. And so my influences, and this goes back to you, how do you build moats? I was really into magazines and TV shows, and I used to read so much in encyclopedias, and I would watch a lot of cable TV. So in my mind, I was building the style of storytelling that I knew, okay, there's going to be competition, but I could basically outrun the competition. So we went through our phases. Again, I'm going to share this. I won't bore you with it. But the point is, we didn't just start off in 2006 successful. We had both different eras where as a company, we were doing different things. But even on YouTube, we were viewing it very differently. And frankly, if you build it, they will come. That's the key. We weren't waiting for companies to come and pay us to produce videos because we were unknowns. And you're not going to be able to convince people to pay you. But ultimately, I recognize that every successful media brand, Wall Street was a printed newspaper, Time was a printed magazine, TED Talks are in-person events, PewDiePie was a YouTube Let's Play show. I needed a hit. And for us, the hit appeared to me in 2011. I had a fork in the road. I said, I really like entrepreneurship, and I see that this geek culture is going to overtake pop culture. And to quote Michael Milken, the best investor is a social scientist, there was really 4 or 5 bets. The first bet was that geek culture would overtake pop culture, right? I mean, Big Bang Theory, Marvel. I would see Kevin Mayer flying high, the Disney executive, dropping bombs, buying Marvel, Pixar, and LucasArts. And I was like, okay, well, Disney's not buying this to sit on it. They're buying this to get behind it. So we also have to double down. Obviously, we're passionate about it. I love doing lists, but you have to connect these dots, right? And lists were a format that people always love. Nobody's going to sit necessarily and watch Ozzy Osbourne's biography. But if I show up and go, these are Ozzy Osbourne's top 10 greatest riffs, yeah, you're like going to click on it and see what those riffs are. And then frankly, YouTube, I don't need to say that anymore. Like without a doubt, I consider myself very lucky for many reasons. One of them is contemporary to YouTube. And then fair use. A lot of our competitors were afraid of fair use. They would call me like a lot of things for embracing fair use. And I was like, well, no, I was born in Iran. I think the liberties of expression and press and media are super critical, and fair use is an expansion of that. This is a pretty hardcore manifesto I wrote where I was like, we're going to take down the establishment. Kind of crazy, but you kind of have to be crazy for people to sometimes take you seriously. And again, the 5th one was the storyteller. The most powerful person in the world is a storyteller. The storyteller sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation that is to come. If you want to succeed at what you do, look at what my fellow investors said. You got to be able to tell your story, right? And so again, we kept iterating. So you're not going to have success in the first month. We tried different things on different platforms. We evolved. We literally went through eras where at every given period, I thought eureka, we found success. But success actually came 6 years later. Now the internet is more developed, things don't take as long, but you really need to kind of map out where you think you're going to be. The rest, as they say, is history. So that's it for me. I saw the time, so as you can see, I decided to rush a little bit because I wanted to leave 15 minutes for Q&A. But next class, just to tip next class, we're going to look at sources of capital, which then come into business planning and, frankly, finance, accounting, and all that jazz.